Welcome to another episode of Boom and Bust. I'm your host, Tony Clement. I'm here at the News Forum where all voices matter. With even more aggressive emissions reduction targets agreed to at the COP26 conference in Glasgow last year, Canada has some unenviable choices to make, some of which will be expensive for consumers. But technology can help, including carbon capture, utilization, and storage. Here to discuss the possibilities is Krystle Wittevrongel. She is a public policy analyst at the Montreal Economic Institute. Welcome to the program, Krystle.
Hi, thank you for having me.
So I guess the first thing for our audience to know is, can you describe what is carbon capture, utilization, and storage?
Absolutely. So as you mentioned in your intro, we've got some pretty ambitious emissions. And carbon capture, utilization, and storage technologies have been around since about the 1970s. They can capture and store or capture and use carbon from large point sources like industrial processes, power plants, and so on, but can also capture and remove carbon that has already been emitted into the atmosphere. So it will then reduce the atmospheric accumulation into what's called a negative net emissions. So the federal government has acknowledged that these are the only technologies that can get us to negative emissions and generate negative emissions. So they provide a wonderful amount of opportunity to help us meet some of our climate goals.
So is the carbon then pumped from the atmosphere into large holding tanks, or how does it work?
So there are a number of different ways of the process is actually occurring. So there is one which is called enhanced oil recovery, which ultimately involves the pumping of carbon dioxide into depleted oil reservoirs, which stores 90 to 95% of the carbon dioxide used. But also the end product is that there are hydrocarbons that are able to be removed further than what they would have historically been just with the regular process of removal. So this can be stored in these depleted oil reservoirs, but also stored in geological formations. So both on and offshore. Ironically enough, is the formations that oil and gas comes from are the best ones actually suited to store these emissions long term. And by long term, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, so IPCC, has given 1,000 years if done correctly. There's a 99% chance of success for 1,000 years. In essence, it's a bigger, more complicated quote, but that's kind of what it boils down to. There's also the use of carbon. So rather than storing it, it can be used and turned into products. We're talking crayons and yoga mats or vodka even. So there are definitely interesting and innovative ways to look at carbon emissions and look at how we can incentivize and broaden the scope of reducing them.
And do Canadian companies, have they been at the forefront of some of the technology around this?
So Canada is considered a leader in CCUS technologies as well as the US. So there's differing reasons for this and kind of differing portfolios, if you will, of the ways in which CCUS is done in these two countries. Canada specifically, we've got abundant geological storage here in Alberta, especially considering our oil and gas industry is what it is. And then, so we're definitely a leader. And then with the oil and gas sector being such a huge focal point of Canadian GDP and Canadian industry for so many years, we have the expertise and we have the infrastructure that can be utilized for this broader CCUS down the road. So some of the same, principles of extracting oil can be used in mirror reverse for the storage.
Right. We're speaking with Krystle Wittevrongel. She is a public policy analyst at the Montreal Economic Institute, talking about carbon capture, utilization, and storage. We're going to take a brief break. We'll be back with Krystle after the break, so please stay with us. Welcome back to Boom and Bust. I'm your host, Tony Clement, here with Krystle Wittevrongel. She is a public policy analyst at the Montreal Economic Institute, talking about carbon capture, utilization, and storage. Krystle, has the government used any incentives to get this technology rolled out in Canada?
So in budget 2021, so we're talking last year, the government did acknowledge the potential behind CCUS. And so moving forward, there has been a proposed investment tax credit for capital invested in CCUS. This tax credit is slated for 2022, so this year, and details are still relatively unknown. There was widespread consultation on the matter. Some of the questions that were available prior to the consultations kind of give an idea of where they might be going with some of these considerations for the tax credit, but nothing is certain as of yet federally. And so going into the consultations, we know that these enhanced oil recovery projects that I mentioned previously are off the table. So other chemical industrial processes, hydrogen production, so on, are still open and available according to what we know at this moment. And they were asking some questions around whether a quantifiable sort of target should be tied to the tax credit, meaning the amount that is required to be captured and used or captured and stored, should that play into it? And while that is definitely something to discuss, we should look at that kind of separate from a investment tax credit. It should be decoupled in that sense. If we look to the United States, they have what's called the 45Q tax credit, and they also apply that to enhanced oil recovery. So within that, they have quite heavy incentives financially to bring that more into large scale development and deployment. Ours is it's still so unknown. And so while it's a step in the right direction and we should be looking at incentivizing this, definitely, we need to consider, what is the best ways, what can we learn from other jurisdictions? And the United States is a great leader in their Section 45Q that we could take note of for sure.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about that. So it sounds like the U.S. is a bit further along in having the collaboration between U.S. Government initiatives and the private sector. Has it been proven to be a success in the United States, or is it still too early to tell?
Well, in 2021, I believe it was the first 9 months, so up till about September of 2021, half of the new developments and new plants and clusters that are in development were slated for the United States. There's great incentives there. They've got regulatory and financial frameworks that interact well. So, looking at just that in itself, I would say there's some pretty good indication that that is the case. And if we look at the enhanced oil recovery piece of it, while we've said, these are not going to be applicable or included in Canada, I really think that is something that should be reconsidered. The United States does 90 to 95% of the enhanced oil recovery in the world right now. And while that does involve hydrocarbon extraction, we know that through at least 2040, there will be a substantial oil demand. So we're still going to be using these hydrocarbons. And so if there's a way to reduce the carbon intensity through something like enhanced oil recovery, it just makes sense on a more nuanced level to do so.
So is that, let's talk a little bit more about enhanced oil recovery. So it's a technology that is able to extract even more oil out of some of these wells, and you think that could be part of the solution?
I do believe so. I think that because of the vilification of the oil and gas industry, which is its own discussion and its own topic, it doesn't even enter the conversation in a lot of cases. And people seem to think that the discussion on this investment tax credit is somewhat of a Trojan horse for continued or expanded oil and gas development, which isn't the case. And studies have shown that by using oil or enhanced oil recovery, it really just decreases the carbon intensity of oil that would have otherwise been emitted, otherwise been used and carbon emitted from other more intense avenues.
We're going to take a brief break with Krystle here. We'll be back after these messages, though. Please stay with us. Welcome back to Boom and Bust. I'm your host, Tony Clement, here with Krystle Wittevrongel. She is a public policy analyst at the Montreal Economic Institute. Krystle, what's up with Quebec banning oil and gas production? So let's talk a little bit about that, what you see as the impact of that, and maybe if it's going down the wrong road, explain your position on that.
I think personally that it is a really big detriment to a number of different areas for Quebec and for Canada. Quebec imports a considerable amount of oil and gas and so on and so forth, natural gas. We can be using this natural gas in Quebec to displace other sorts of more carbon intensive energies overseas. I think personally that it is a really, really bad position. It sets a bad precedent, I think, for continued more extreme measures that don't do well for helping Canada as a whole. When we're talking about emissions reductions, this is a global issue. So Canada should be focusing on where are our strengths. Quebec can be focusing on where are its strengths. How can we work together collaboratively to reach these, widespread goals that are all related to negative emissions or net zero by 2050? I think that by banning and revoking these oil and gas storage permits in Quebec, it's damaging to more than just Quebec. It's damaging to Canada. It's damaging globally, I believe, as well.
Yeah, natural gas these days is considered a transitional energy in that it could be a good bridge between a lot dirtier options like coal or even oil, and help us transition to cleaner renewables somewhere down the line where they're a lot more viable. So this is kind of cutting your nose to spite your face, isn't it?
Exactly. And so looking at CCUS technologies, tying it to that same thought, is many think that it's a way to, like I mentioned, Trojan horse for the oil and gas industry, but that's actually not where we're going to see the biggest impact. It's these other industries like steel and cement, who are very, very emission intensive and don't have other options right now. So by not focusing on developing our capacity for CCUS, which could really be helpful to these sectors, which ultimately, globally, with 12 to 14% of global GHG emissions being tied to these sectors with growing demand, we can be bridging those emissions in the same way that you mentioned for natural gas as well.
Let's talk a little bit about Canadian Innovators a bit more. Is this an area where innovations in this area from Canada can lead the way globally?
I think so. I think that from what I know from the literature and research and what's out there, is there are so many interacting factors that contribute to large-scale deployment. So it's not just financial, it's not just economic, it's geological. We've got the capacities here, we've got the expertise, we are developing frameworks and regulatory measures. If those are done responsibly and in collaboration with the private sector in ways to incentivize and innovate, there are definite opportunities here. We've got so much experience and so much expertise that could be put to use from sectors like oil and gas. Our geological basins are gigantic. There's a real opportunity. And I think by getting this investment tax credit right and adding to it with performance-based measures like the Section 45Q, we could be leading. We are a leader, but we could be leading.
I guess the thing that you've you've written in your publications is really we need this technology if we're going to meet our net zero targets. Is that right?
Exactly. And as I mentioned, we've got these industries like steel and cement where there are no other options. And so other than using these, carbon intensive methods in production. And so while there are ways of doing things electrically and, greening and that sort of thing, we need to just shift the conversation and be a little bit more nuanced on, okay, where can we not abate these emissions currently? And it's in these sectors like steel, like cement, chemical production that are emitting enormous amounts of greenhouse gases. And the demand, as I said, is not going to disappear overnight. It's going to continue growing. Let's find a way to make this work.
Welcome back to Boom and Bust. I'm your host, Tony Clement, here with Krystle Wittevrongel. She is a public policy analyst at the Montreal Economic Institute. Krystle, not trying to belabor the point, but it seems like all of the public policy hitherto, maybe the last budget being the start of an exception, but hitherto has been all about carbon taxes and how carbon taxes are going to drive us to net zero. But really, your point is you've got to use a different suite of public policy options if we're going to meet our targets. So that's what you're hoping to see more of this in future federal budgets and provincial policies then?
Absolutely. And so when we look back at COP26, one of the things that came out of COP26 was the Glasgow Climate Pact, which has about 200 signatories. Canada is one of them. And within that, they recognize the need to accelerate technological advancements and other sorts of ways of looking at deeper, more sustained, and more rapid greenhouse gas emission reductions. So technologically, we know that we need to do this. The federal government has said we cannot get to net zero without it. Other agencies have also said this. It's really a matter of looking at it. The technologies have been available in one form or another since the 70s. They're there. They just haven't been developed on a large scale due to a number of things like large, operating costs or upfront costs and that sort of thing.
Right.
So this investment tax credit could really do a great service to helping those get off the ground. And then a performance-based tax credit could really do a great service to helping innovate and find more efficient and more robust methods of capturing more, storing more, and using more. If the incentives are there, I do believe we will start to see some sustained movement in these fields.
We talked a little bit about the United States and their kind of moving forward with alacrity in some of these areas. Is there anywhere else in the world that stands out as getting the policy right on carbon capture, utilization, and storage?
I don't know if I would say anywhere really has it right. There are some places where it seems to be more motivating. And like we've talked about, the United States is sort of more of a business case for investment when it comes to their policies surrounding carbon capture, utilization, and storage. There are some jurisdictions in Europe, although they have their own challenges as well. I do think that our regulatory, our financial, our organizational factors here in Canada, along with the United States, we do have great potential. It also falls to where the storage basins lie. There are costs associated with the operating of these facilities as well, transporting the emissions from one place to another before they're stored. There's great costs that lie with that. And so the more we get deployed, the quicker we get these up to scale and on a larger scale, we can start to see declining costs as well. So I think while there is nowhere that has perfect policy, I think there are some bits and pieces we can learn, but we do have the potential to lead in this area.
Do you think at the next COP meeting, this will be more of a mainstream topic? Is that what your aspiration would be?
I think so. I think that seeing over the last year how many new CCUS facilities and clusters and that sort of thing have come onto the books, I think is a very promising sign. there are long lead times to some of these projects as well. So while we're seeing them coming up and coming into fruition, it'll be a number of years before they're actually operational and, starting to see those huge sustained reductions that we anticipate. But I think that as more get up and running and more are operational as time goes on, we will start to have a bigger part of the conversation, because there are bigger benefits that are more tangible in the moment of that COP27 that will be coming up.
Krystle Wittevrongel, thank you so much for joining us here on Boom and Bust today. A very interesting chat, and we wish you well in your research.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Yeah, so as we saw there's a real interesting take on some of the technology that Canada will need to meet its net zero targets that it is committed to after the COP26 conference in Glasgow, including carbon capture, utilization, and storage. We've got some natural advantages. We've got some great innovations in this country. It would be very interesting and hopefully see this be rolled out a little bit more across the country. Thanks for watching today.